Welcome, students, to Lecture 11 of MHHS 1. Today, we're looking at the essay Promissory Futures, Medicine and Markets in Speculative Fiction by Sherryl Vint in our English department. There are no section breaks in this essay, so I'll break the essay down into its thematic pieces for you. There is an overall argument in the essay about the social potential of speculative fiction in portraying the medical commodification of human bodies. And then there are rich descriptions of several examples from the PBS series Future States, which ran from 2010 to 2014, where we can see this argument in action. These also correspond to the two modes of analysis in this essay. Number one, a theoretical investigation that uses research from the sociology and anthropology of medicine to make a point about the, quote, conflation of medicine, markets, and borders. And number two, close readings of a cluster of Future States episodes that all examine the common theme of, quote, the status of immigrants and their heightened vulnerability to exploitation via biomedical practices. In this lecture, I'll focus on that first part. And in the next lecture, we'll get to that second part. We'll get into the close readings of specific episodes that you'll watch for yourselves online and see the syllabus for that information. For my own browsing, it seems like Hollow, Refuge, Crossover, and The Living are all available to watch online for free. Before we get into the argument, I think it'll be helpful to understand the intellectual context of this piece. This essay is part of what's known in the academic publishing industry as an edited collection. So far, we've seen standalone essays in peer-reviewed journals. We've seen standalone essays in peer-reviewed journals that become part of single-authored books. What we have now is a different thing. So standalone essays, single-authored books, and now we're encountering a different kind of book known as the edited collection. So this means that an editor or editors invite a collection of scholars to write essays around a chosen topic. The essay that we've read for today is chapter 3 of a book called South of the Future, Marketing Care and Speculating Life in South Asia and the Americas, published in 2020. The editors, Anandita Banerjee and Deborah A. Castillo, assembled scholars to investigate gendered and racialized economies of care in South Asia and the Americas. So just to get a good sense of what this is all about, let's take a look at the marketing blurb of this edited collection together, and we can get a sense of what's at stake here and how Sherryl Vint's essay about promissory futures and speculative fiction fits into this investigative effort. So, quote, this is a quote from the marketing blurb. South Asia and Latin America represent two epicenters of migrant care work and the globalized reproductive market. Yet scholars and the media continue to examine them in geographical and conceptual isolation. South of the Future closes both these gaps. It investigates nannying, elder care, domestic work, and other forms of migrant labor in the Americas, together with the emerging Wild West of biotechnology and surrogacy in the Indian subcontinent. So the editors have here identified an investigative gap in the critical literature about, quote, migrant care work and the globalized reproductive market. They say that when we talk about South Asia and when we talk about Latin America, we talk about them in, quote, geographical and conceptual isolation. So this edited collection will draw generative connections between migrant care work in the Americas and reproductive surrogacy work in South Asia. So hopefully we can already sense here how the essay we read for today will fit into this edited collection. Vint examines several instances in the PBS series in which people in vulnerable positions can be put into impossible positions that demand them to instrumentalize, medicalize, and commodify their own bodies just to survive. So the blurb goes on, the marketing blurb goes on to talk about the editor's method to assemble this group of scholars to talk about this issue of migrant care work and and the bigger globalized biomedical market. Quote, "The volume is profoundly interdisciplinary and includes both prominent and emerging scholars from a wide variety of fields, including anthropology, law, literary and cultural studies, science and technology studies, and social policy. These contributors speak to the dynamic, continually changing facets of the nexus of care and value across these two key regions of the global South." So this edited collection is, quote, "profoundly interdisciplinary for the same reasons that our MHHS program is." And recall the long list of departments in the first lecture. To investigate something as unwieldy as human health and disease will require cross-disciplinary conversations to happen outside of the usual departmental silos of our academic discourse. The editors speak to a, quote, "wide variety of fields," and we hear this echoed in Vint's own essay when she frames her intervention by citing research in what is known as science and technology studies, abbreviated STS, when she talks about utopian studies, sociology, and anthropology. So Vint's own specialty in speculative fiction is situated within an interdisciplinary conversation, both in the essay itself and among the various chapters of the edited collection as a whole. So after establishing the research gap it's addressing and its interdisciplinary methodology, the marketing blurb for that edited collection finally gets to the intellectual payoff about centering vulnerable bodies in the biomedical economies of the global South. Quote, "By mobilizing specific locations and techno-economics and putting them into dialogue with one another, South of the Future rematerializes the gendered, racialized bodies that are far too often rendered invisible in structural analyses of the global South, or else are confined to particular geo- and biopolitical paradigms of emerging markets. Instead, these bodies occupy the center of a global, highly financialized economy of creating and sustaining life." Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. What this edited collection does, according to this marketing blurb, is to analyze the global South, not just with abstract comments on exploitative systems and structures, but on the real lived experiences of individual bodies who are navigating this world of global market capitalism. And if that term global South is unfamiliar, it just means those countries south of the wealthy global North. The countries in the global South, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, are usually characterized by low income, exploitation, and overpopulation. So instead of offering abstract critiques of global capitalism, this cluster of essays is supposed to feature the individual narratives of those medicalized and instrumentalized bodies that are frequently brushed off as the casualties of capitalist progress. So that's the larger project of the edited collection, but now let's take a look at this specific essay by Sherryl Vint. So as usual, this lecture will capture the broad strokes of the argument by examining only the first and last parts of the essay. Now, as I mentioned before, there are no section divisions. So I'll just make some for you. So when I talk about the first and last part, the first part I'll section off as pages 73 to 77, right before Vint starts talking about the future states episode called Remigration. So those first 5 pages state very clearly what Vint's argument is, the methodology used, and what the objects of analysis are. So if we're thesis hunting, as we did with Susan Zeger's essay, we'll probably settle on this very meaty sentence here. Quote, "My focus is especially on science fiction, SF, texts that examine the border as a fraught space for negotiating the economies of bodies and health, whether these are the transnational borders relevant to transplant and surrogacy economies, or the borders established between communities of the privileged and the dispossessed, used to distribute uneven conditions of health or to distribute unevenly conditions of health or deprivation. So as with Susan Zeger's essay, there's some really helpful signposting here to tell us what is going to happen in this analysis. We know that the objects of analysis are of the SF variety, science fiction or speculative fiction. Imaginings of the future, even though the topic about borders is actually very current and very contemporary. What we also get is a very generalized notion of what Vint means by, quote, the border. So it's not just the protected and policed borders of nation states, but also the more abstract borders between the haves and the have-nots. The promise of science and medicine frequently sounds essentially neutral, something rational, something politically inert and objective. But the analysis to follow that we get from Vint will show how these fictitious SF futures implicate and amplify the biomedical inequities of the present. Vint also highlights 3 secondary texts that serve as the theoretical backdrop of her analysis of the Future States episodes. First up is Kaushik Sundar Rajan's Biocapital, The Constitution of Post-Genomic Life, published in 2006. So when academic articles cite secondary texts like this, you have the option of checking that book out for the full argument, but it's not fully necessary if you just want to understand the argument at hand. So you can make your choice here. Vint explains for you how Rajan's book is useful and illuminating. It, quote, suggests that we should understand the discourse of venture capital as, quote, promissory futuristic discourse, hype that constitutes the discursive grounds on which reality unfolds. Here now, we now have a better understanding of the title of Vint's essay about promissory futures. The word promissory describes something that is implying, usually within a legal framework, some kind of promise. The biocapital of Rajan's title refers to a capitalistic society that instrumentalizes biological bodies for the promise of a better future. This selling of bodies and biological labor for the promise of an unfolding future is not set in stone, however. Vint posits that, quote, SF can help us envision and materialize alternative futures that seek to transform rather than intensify these forces. All right, second, Vint cites a collection of essays edited by Sheila Jasanoff and Sang-Kyun Kim called Dreamscapes of Modernity, Sociotechnical Imaginaries, and the Fabrication of Power, published in 2015. So that book serves Vint as another way to see how the imagination, including SF, can shape how technologies develop. The imaginative impulse here is transformative and utopian rather than strictly pessimistic or even nihilistic. What Jasanoff and Kim call the socio-technical imaginaries can be used as a force for good, a force for positive change. So SF can point out all the dystopian aspects of how markets are shaping medicine and instrumentalizing our vulnerable bodies, but it can also direct us to cultivate better biotechnical futures. And finally, the third kind of intertext here, Vint considers Sabrina Vorvolius's novel Ink, published in 2012, to give a concrete example of how SF does all this. The novel's plot involves an inked immigrant population. Their tattoos represent varying degrees of belonging and value to the biopolitical state. The novel's speculative imagining of racialized quarantine and sterilization comes from a deep well of historical precedent and warns us effectively against a rosy technological future purchased at the expense of devaluing and dehumanizing certain populations. By imagining this all too possible future of racialized public health policy, the novel's, quote, socio-technical imaginaries, even though they sound utterly dystopian, are meant to signal transformative and utopian possibilities. And finally, I had you watch The Living for today, because Vint's essay concludes with a rich description of this episode of the PBS series Future States. The title itself, The Living, conveys quite nicely its relevance to our MHHS discussions. So if we don't think about it too much, we're probably pretty confident that the category of the living is something that medicine can define with at least an acceptable level of objectivity and precision. But what SF and MHHS encourage us to do is to think about it more critically. In this short film that you watched for today, there's what's called an organ harvesting initiative that has developed after a series of earthquakes created refugee zones on the east coast of the United States. Luther, a diabetic African-American man, has decided to donate his organs while he's actually still alive to support his wife and his daughter. What exactly is then, quote, the living, if the very concept of life changes at the whim of environmental, political, and market forces? So the story's protagonist is Isaac, the doctor sent to the refugee zone to harvest Luther's organs. It all seems strangely natural and rational in the beginning until Isaac gets to know Luther's daughter Zion. The state had, as Vint describes it, quote, chosen to redefine what the living means, privileging the lives of those whose economic contributions make them matter more. And in the beginning, it seems like Isaac is actually perfectly fine with all of this. The state's demands for the public good can frequently sound like a perfectly calculated equation of the best benefit for the greatest number of people. After all, isn't that what a state is for? They should have these things figured out, it seems. What I think the short film does really well is to show us how easy it would be to become complicit in this kind of unthinking acceptance of a system that is just completely built on structural health inequities. The living ends, however, on a somewhat upbeat note when Isaac actually returns to the refugee zone, changed by his encounter with the individual stories of those affected by such a system of structural health inequities, by Zion and by Luther. Vint, I think, seems to end with this story because it has the clearest direction to transformative and utopian change. Quote, the overwhelmingly dystopian tone of these tales is balanced with their clear commitment to creating another kind of future. So instead of just making us wallow in the inevitable heat death of the universe, the living, especially among all these films, reveals that there's still a lot we can do and to work on so that we can repair the health inequities that have structured our lives and our attitudes towards life itself. Vint ends with something she calls post-vital subjectivity, which refers to a mode of being that conceives of life as only alive to be instrumental in a public health discourse of medicine, markets, and borders. Luther's sacrifice for his family and Isaac's initial complacency about the public health system exemplify this SF expansion of these zones of post-vital subjectivity. As we see with Isaac, the more stories that we tell about these post-vital subjectivities, the more we can promise ourselves a more inclusive, diverse, and just future.